All right, joining me is Matt Hougan, Chief Investment Officer at Bitwise, who's the country's largest crypto index fund manager. And beyond that, they offer a full suite of crypto investments and strategies spanning ETFs, SMAs, private funds. They really do it all. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about Bitwise is that they lead with education. I've said this for a while now, but it's clear that educating the marketplace on crypto is foundational to everything that Bitwise does. And I would say nobody better to help lead that charge than the one and only Matt Hougan. Matt, how have you been?
Nate, what an introduction. It's great to see you. I'm doing well, and thanks for having me on.
It's so funny. I know I'm a broken record, but I feel like I see you everywhere. I don't know how you do it. Like every time I turn around, you're on mainstream financial media, you're on a podcast like this, you're hosting some event or moderating a panel. Like nobody can ever accuse you of not attempting to get the word out on crypto.
I love that. I'm doing my best. My frequent flyer account would attest to what you're saying. I have been. Look, there's a lot of demand for people to learn about this market, and that's persisted for a while. It's actually accelerating. So I try to be everywhere, and I enjoy talking to investors about it.
All right. So, on the note of you jetting around the country, let's start with this event that Bitwise hosted in New York City last week, which I'm so disappointed that I missed. But I thought this was really unique. So, this was the Bitcoin Standard Corporation's Investor Day. And this obviously focused on companies buying and holding Bitcoin. I guess first, how did you come up with the idea behind this event?
Yeah, so we think this is a mega trend. It's one of those interesting things that happens in crypto where a lot of the world is skeptical that this is really going on. But when you look at the data, it's a big deal. So obviously, everyone knows that Michael Saylor at MicroStrategy or now Strategy has been buying Bitcoin. But what a lot of people don't realize is it's not just him. There are actually 80 publicly traded companies buying Bitcoin. They're buying a lot of Bitcoin. Last year, companies bought about 350,000 Bitcoin. They're on pace to increase that this year. And so we wanted to shine a light on what we think is one of the most important drivers of Bitcoin demand this year and into the future. So we decided to bring together, Michael Saylor, Saifedean Ammous, the author of the Bitcoin Standard, the leaders of a number of publicly traded companies that are acquiring Bitcoin, whether it's crypto companies like Kraken or non-crypto companies like Semler Scientific, and investors for a sort of half day to really focus on this theme and ask ourselves, how big do we think this could be? It was a phenomenal day. I came out very energized, and I came out thinking that this theme is still bigger than many people expect.
Yeah, I guess along with that, I mean, any other key takeaways? I know this is a space that you spend a lot of time researching. You just gave some great stats. I saw something like 700,000 Bitcoin in total are now held by public companies, which is remarkable. But any other key takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, so publicly traded companies have already bought 100% of the new supply of Bitcoin this year. In other words, the Bitcoin network is going to produce about 165,000 Bitcoin this year. Publicly traded companies have bought almost that much, and we're only through April. So this is a big deal from a supply demand perspective. The two other insights I really enjoyed, I moderated a panel with three sort of executive leaders of companies and asked them why their companies in particular were buying Bitcoin. And what was interesting to me is they each had different answers. One was doing it because they wanted to demonstrate that they had an affinity with their audience. Another one was doing it because they just thought Bitcoin was a good investment and they had excess cash. And then the third, Semler Scientific, which is a medical equipment device manufacturer, did it because they had a legacy business that was throwing off a huge amount of cash but wasn't growing, and they didn't expect it to grow. And so they had to figure out what to do with this cash. And the chairman of that company said something interesting to me. He said, Matt, there are like a couple hundred companies that fit this bill, that have established businesses that aren't growing, but are very profitable. And he thought that many of those companies would end up buying Bitcoin. In fact, he's been talking to a number of other firms that are going to follow in his stead. So it just, put it together to me that this is not a blip. This is a trend. That's what you see in the data. That's what we heard in the stories. And I think we're going to end the year and these companies are going to own a million plus Bitcoin and be growing from there.
Yeah, I think I saw a comment from Kraken CFO at your event where she said something like she expects around 20% of public companies to own Bitcoin a couple of years from now. Do you think that's reasonable?
Well, I think if you give it 10 years, maybe, I don't know about 2 years, but the reality is companies hold more cash today than they ever have in their history, right? Their records amount of corporate cash. We've seen the dollar lose 20% of its value over the last 5+ years. M&A is very difficult and risky. Companies aren't being rewarded for paying those out as dividends. So what do? I think a non-zero number of those companies that are sitting on this record cash are going to move it into Bitcoin. That's what we've seen for the past year. You know, they say the most expensive words in finance are this time it's different. People who are doubting this trend are saying this time it's different. I just don't see why that would be the case. So I don't know if it'll be 20% of public companies in 2 or 3 years, but I wouldn't be shocked if that happened in the next 10 years. And I wouldn't be shocked if we saw one of the Mag 7 buy Bitcoin on their balance sheet in the next year or two. I do think this is happening at a much bigger degree than people give it credit for.
You mentioned the three reasons or the angles as to why a company may want to buy Bitcoin or why they're potentially considering this. Do you have any sense as to how difficult it is for corporations to get buy-in? And before you answer that, a quick side note here, which I think you may appreciate. Believe it or not, in my prior life, I actually used to manage treasury operations. So this was at a smaller, privately held tech company. But the reason I bring that up, I remember how tight the investment policy statement was. Like it was all very conservative investment options. And I think it would have been very difficult to get the board of directors to allow Bitcoin. I would say even today.
Yeah.
And again, this was a tech company. And so do you have any sense as to how these companies are getting buy-in to own Bitcoin and maybe what that process looks like?
Yeah, I think it is challenging. That's why I said I think, I'll take the 10-year version and not the 2-year version. I will say that I think it's gotten substantially easier. Just like it's gotten easier for financial advisors to recommend Bitcoin now that they're qualified custodians and ETFs and less regulatory risk, and the US government has a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The same is true of companies. And that's why we've seen it expand from just MicroStrategy to a broader array of companies. But of course, it's challenging. This is a volatile asset. It still has, some regulatory and reputational overhead risk. And what that means is we're not going to see the largest companies in the world do it tomorrow. But the analogy I like to make, Nate, is to think about asset managers in the crypto space. If we go back 5 years, it was only crypto specific companies like Bitwise and Grayscale. And then along came family owned firms like Fidelity and VanEck. And today we have BlackRock and Invesco. Why won't we see the same thing? For a while, it was crypto only companies like MicroStrategy. And then it was Tesla and Block and Semler Scientific. Why do we assume we won't get to these other companies as well? It's still hard. As you mentioned, these are conservative companies. I don't think it will be everyone. I don't think it'll be instant. But I do think everything I see in the data suggests we're on this path. And I don't know why it would recede rather than expand in the future. That's what it's been doing. And I suspect that will continue into the future.
Well, and there's certainly some game theory at play here, maybe better said, network effect. To your point, let's say we have one of the Mag 7 companies jump in and they own Bitcoin. That's going to get the attention of a lot of other companies. And maybe that's an obvious statement, but once you have that happen, that could be a real accelerating factor in corporate adoption of Bitcoin. Before we move on, because I do want to talk, no surprise to you, about spot Bitcoin ETFs, but on this topic of Bitcoin being held in corporate treasury, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the new ETF that Bitwise launched back in March. So the Bitwise Bitcoin Standard Corporations ETF, ticker symbol OWNB. So OWNB, that is a great ticker symbol. I wouldn't expect anything less from you. But in a nutshell, this holds stocks of companies that own at least 1,000 Bitcoin on their balance sheets. And so top holdings include usual suspects like Strategy and Riot Platforms, those types of companies. But just give us the investment case here. Like, why should an investor consider owning companies who themselves own Bitcoin?
Yeah, well, for one, there are a number of investors who can't gain access to Bitcoin directly for various investment policy restrictions or platform restrictions. This gives you a way to get exposure to Bitcoin via the equity market, often slightly levered exposure to Bitcoin via the equity market. And so it's a solution for many investors who want that exposure but can't buy the Bitcoin or the Bitcoin ETF directly. The other reason is, look, these are forward thinking companies. They're on, in my view, the right side of technology history, and they're expressing that through this vector of owning Bitcoin. So you get a unique mix of companies. They've been performing exceptionally well. We've had a number of creation units come into the ETF. Again, I think this is a powerful theme. I love the ticker as well. And for people who want exposure to these companies, why not do it in a diversified package rather than just betting on any one of them, right? Sort of classic ETF story.
I think this might change over time, but I'm curious how correlated is OwnB to Bitcoin at this point. And again, as we have other companies that come in, we talked about Mag7 or whatever, I think that this profile may change a little bit. But what does it look like as we sit here today?
Yeah, it's really correlated. It's very correlated right now because these are many of these are primarily, just owning Bitcoin as their primary use case. As you said, as this spreads to more general companies, that correlation will be diluted over time. But right now, what we're seeing is a high correlation and a slightly elevated leverage level. We're not talking, 2x, 1.1, 1.2x, right? Slight leverage and high correlation, which is an attractive way to gain exposure to Bitcoin. So I think a lot of people are going to be interested in it.
Okay, so that's the OwnB ETF. Let's move over to the spot Bitcoin ETF side. Of course, Bitwise offers BitB, BITB, the Bitwise Bitcoin ETF. And I saw a note that you wrote earlier this week where you said that you're still expecting record inflows into this category overall this year. And it sounds like one of the reasons for that is because you believe that the big wirehouses, so we're talking, Merrill, Morgan, UBS, Wells Fargo, you believe that they're all going to allow easier access to Bitcoin ETFs for their advisors by the end of the year. And I think, Matt, I've said this over and over again. I believe we're still extremely early in Bitcoin ETF adoption, particularly by advisors. And certainly a big part of that is just the lack of access. And so I'd love to have you talk specifically about that and then perhaps anything else that you're hearing from advisors on allocating to Bitcoin ETFs since you're visiting with them every day.
Yeah, I'll give you two stories, Nate, which I think encapsulate why I'm so bullish. I was speaking at the Barron's Top Teams Conference, which is one of the gathering of the largest financial advisors in the United States, right? People with multi-billion, 10 billion, $50 billion books. And I asked them, how many of you can buy spot Bitcoin ETFs today in your platform? And only about 40% of the room raised their hand. So we had 35, $37 billion of inflows last year, and the majority of large financial advisors couldn't even buy. Fast forward a few more weeks, I gave the closing day one keynote speech to one of the wirehouse's major advisor annual conferences. That invitation wasn't open to me in 2024. It wasn't open to me in 2023, but it is open to me now. When you put those together, I think what that means is substantially everyone is going to allow exposure to Bitcoin ETFs by the middle or by the fall, by the middle of this year or by the fall. And there's just a huge amount of money that hasn't had a chance to come in. I think it's going to come in. The big four wirehouses control something like $11 trillion in client assets, right? If you get 1% of that, you're talking about $110 billion of net inflows. That's 3x what we saw last year. We have seen flows turn around recently, right? We did about $4 billion through the first 4 months of the year. For what it's worth, that's pretty good for a small ETF area, but I think they're going to accelerate dramatically. I actually feel pretty confident we're going to get close to or above last year's flows as we see price tick up and as we see these platforms turn on, which, every conversation I'm having tells me that that's happening right now.
Well, and you and I have talked about this in the past. I don't think people fully appreciate the due diligence process that a lot of advisors go through. Some people expect this to be an overnight endeavor, and it's not. Advisors, just in general, tend to move much slower, they're much more methodical. And so allocating to something like Bitcoin, which is an emerging asset class, it's an emerging category, is not something they're just going to turn around and do on a dime. And there's a lot of learning that has to take place. I know that, again, that's where you spend a lot of time at Bitwise, just educating advisors on why they may want to own Bitcoin in a portfolio, how historically it is acted in a portfolio, how to properly position size, those sorts of things. There's a lot there for advisors to digest. By the way, on the note that I mentioned that you wrote last week, I loved how you framed the discussion for advisors who are skeptical on Bitcoin. And maybe you can talk a little bit about this. And if I had to describe this, I'll try to do this eloquently. You sort of flipped a script and you said, okay, well, what would it take for you to believe Bitcoin is here to stay? Right. And you went through a number of different categories where you said, okay, well, do you want institutional custody? Well, guess what? We have that. Do you want regulatory stability? We have that. Do you want government adoption? Well, the U.S. is going to pursue a strategic Bitcoin reserve. I thought that was a really good way to, frame, and I'm sure these are things that you're hearing every day, right, from advisors. And I guess I just tie that back into the spot Bitcoin ETFs because there is a lot of skepticism, and that skepticism also bleeds into the due diligence process. So maybe you can talk a little bit about all that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on the due diligence side, another, to put some context on why I'm so bullish, the average Bitwise client meets with us 6 to 10 times before they make their first allocation. And if you think about them meeting with us on a quarterly basis, if they started meeting with us when the ETFs launched in January of 2024, we're just getting to that sixth meeting now, right? And that's standard. That's normal. That's how advisors work. I do think crypto has the wrong perception. That's something they see it and they buy it. That's sort of a crypto retail perspective. Advisors move slow, but when they move with force. And as mentioned, we're just getting to that Bitwise sweet spot of our sixth meeting. It's tiring, but you do get there. Yeah, I love this story. This actually happened, after that Wirehouse speech. You give a speech, you get off stage, and all these people come and they surround you and they ask you follow-up one-on-one questions. And this one gentleman waited until the end and he said, he loved everything that he heard, but there was still something holding him back, right? He couldn't quite put his hand on it. He sort of worried what would happen if everyone stopped believing in Bitcoin. At least if everyone stopped believing in gold, you'd still have this shiny rock. He was worried about custody. He was worried about all these things. And what I asked him at the end was, what would it take? Could you actually write down what it would take for you to finally make an allocation to Bitcoin? Would you need to see, as you mentioned, institutional custody? Because we have that. Institutional trading, we have Jane Street and Susquehanna. Large asset managers in the space, we have BlackRock. Institutions adopting Bitcoin, we have the Texas Retirement System. The US adopting Bitcoin itself, we have a strategic Bitcoin reserve. I raised this with him because one of my experiences talking to advisors over the years is they constantly move the goal line, right? If we go back a few years ago, once we have institutional custody, then I'll allocate. Or once we have an ETF, then I'll allocate. Or once the regulatory risk is de-risked, then I'll allocate. And by forcing you to say what it actually would take and to write it down, I think it shows people how far this industry has come. What are you waiting for Bitcoin to have the same volatility as gold? Well, that's fine, but you're going to miss out on all the upside because by the time it's as low volatile as gold, all of the gains will be in Bitcoin. And I think it's a good question for people who haven't allocated to ask themselves, what would it actually take? What would you have to see? Would you have to see every government establish a Bitcoin strategic reserve? That's fine. Then don't pay attention to Bitcoin and it's going to be, much higher than it is today when you buy. And at the end of the chat, the guy thought about it and left saying, I guess I'm going to go buy some Bitcoin. So, maybe it was effective.
I know that you are never dismissive of any concerns that a prospective advisor or investor would have around allocating to Bitcoin. I think you always view that as an opportunity for education. But what's left to push back on other than somebody just doesn't believe Bitcoin has any value? Which, if that's what you believe, I think that's a perfectly fine position. If you want to take that, we can debate that, but if you want to take that position, that's fine. But is there anything that comes up in conversations where you go, okay, that's a great point? Or do you think a lot of the sort of mainstream concerns or issues are largely solved now?
That's the thing. When you look at Bitcoin right now, it's just been enormously de-risked over the last couple of years. The thing that always, sort of caught me in the past was what if the government just bans it, right? Or seizes it the way we seized gold in 1933. And for a number of years, I didn't have a good response to that one, right? The government is a big, powerful entity. The incredible thing is that's been de-risked. We now have a strategic Bitcoin reserve with 200,000 Bitcoin. We're looking to add to that. There are 12 countries around the world that own Bitcoin. It's sort of escaped and solved that problem. I think it's mostly down to the passage of time, right? If what's happened for the last 15 years continues to happen, which is more institutions move into the space, more governments move into the space, more corporations move into the space, it becomes more accepted, there's more regulatory protection, it becomes more normalized. If that continues to happen, I think it's just a matter of time. And I would note, we've recently seen Bitcoin really acting like a global macro mature asset, right? It's been zigging when the rest of the market zagged. It hasn't been behaving like tech stocks. As that starts to, become more and more true, I think it just accelerates into the mainstream. So I don't know. There are plenty of reasons people don't buy it. It's very volatile. Maybe they're not comfortable with that volatility, but I think it's becoming normalized as a mainstream asset. And I think as that happens, you're going to see, literally hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars have to move into this space.
And I think you made a good point earlier. And we're certainly not here to make any sort of price predictions on Bitcoin. I want to be very clear about that. But I thought you made a good point in that if you're waiting for every single potential risk to go away, you have to consider what does that mean in terms of your future returns? How long are you going to wait for every little thing to be de-risked? I think that's a good point and something that advisors and investors should consider. Just a few minutes left. I love what you were saying just about Bitcoin's recent price action and price performance, and that I do think it's decoupled a little bit from stocks. So I was looking this morning. If you just run performance over the past month or so, Bitcoin is up 18%, while the S&P 500 is about flat.
Hmm.
And I think, as you know, prior to the recent market turmoil, there had been this narrative, and I don't know that it's gone away. It may never go away, but that Bitcoin simply moves in lockstep with risk assets, right? It moves very similarly to tech stocks or whatever. And you can debunk that if you want, but I'm more curious just how noteworthy you think this recent price action is, and maybe what it tells us moving forward.
It tells us something really important. I'm glad that you raised it because it is true. If you look back at previous broad market tantrums, whether that was the last China trade war in 2018 or the taper tantrum or other sort of macro pullbacks, in those periods, for the short window that those were acutely felt, it's absolutely true that Bitcoin fell along with stocks and indeed fell more than stocks during that period. And as you mentioned, during this sort of tariff tantrum, we've seen Bitcoin go up, act as a hedge, even as equities have been extremely volatile. What it tells me is something really important. This is the first macro tantrum where traditional investors could access Bitcoin. This is the first macro shock where there's been a Bitcoin ETF and a large liquid Bitcoin derivatives market, which meant traditional macro hedge funds and traditional investors have had Bitcoin in their toolkit. And what we've seen is what they've used Bitcoin for is to hedge exposure to this macro risk. That's what's driving it up. And I think the future is one where more traditional investors consider Bitcoin as part of the quiver. And so I expect that we're going to see this sort of pattern repeat in the future. The Bitcoin of today really is different than the Bitcoin of 5 years ago, right? That was a Bitcoin driven by retail investors and crypto native investors. This is increasingly a Bitcoin driven by institutions, corporations, governments, and macro hedge funds. And you're seeing it behave differently. You're seeing it behave more like a hedge asset. I think it's maturing before our eyes, right? Bitcoin's a teenager. It's 15 years old. It's in a transition phase from a risk asset to a hedge asset. But I think that's the direction of travel. I think you're going to see it act like that more and more in the future. And as it does, it's just going to bring more investors into it because it's a really useful tool in the macro quiver.
Yeah, it's a great point too, just regarding institutions now having access to Bitcoin or easier access. And you hit on this before. We've seen that in the flows here recently. I mean, we've had some of the best weeks in terms of flows into spot Bitcoin ETFs since the category launched in January of 2024. So you marry up that interest with obviously the performance of Bitcoin, and I think it is telling a story here, which is pretty interesting. But Matt, I always enjoy connecting. You never disappoint with excellent insight. So thank you for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great questions, and let's do it again soon.
That was Matt Hougan, Chief Investment Officer at Bitwise. Hope everyone enjoyed this episode of Crypto Prime. Please leave a review or give us a like wherever you're listening or watching. That obviously helps other people find this show. And as always, feel free to send me questions or comments. You can do that at cryptoprimepodcast.com. See you again next week.
Crypto Prime is hosted by Nate Geraci, president of OTR Media LLC. Nate is also president of the investment advisory firm The ETF Store. While OTR Media LLC and the ETF Store are related by common ownership, they are separate and distinct entities, and anything discussed on this program should not be construed as an official statement by the ETF Store. This program is for informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice. Investing in crypto assets involves substantial risk, including the potential loss of principal. Any past performance figures discussed are not necessarily indicative of future results. Visit cryptoprimepodcast.com for more information.